Today's podcast features two separate, unique stories that share a theme: the terrifying things people will do for money. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from my YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Graphic Content, and it's about a TV show that was extremely popular in Brazil until its secret was revealed. The second story you'll hear is called Inside a Nigerian Death Factory, and it is about the horrible thing that was discovered inside of a warehouse in the middle of a Nigerian forest. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer the 5-star review button a free acupuncture session, but once they're lying down, give them a full-body allergy test. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called Graphic Content. If I told you to picture the Amazon rainforest in your head, you would likely picture a dense tropical wilderness full of amazing and exotic animals. And you'd be right, that is a good representation of the Amazon rainforest, but what a lot of people don't know is that the Amazon rainforest is also home to a massive city. It's called Manaus, and it sits right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, right along the Amazon River. And it happens to be one of the most violent places in the entire world. All it takes in Manaus is simply walking down the wrong street or crossing the wrong person, and you can get shot or stabbed in broad daylight, and there's virtually nothing anyone can do to stop it. In 1989, a 31-year-old former police officer named Wallace Souza decided to make a TV show about what it was actually like to live in his hometown of Manaus. And unlike other crime shows in Brazil that often censored out the most graphic content they covered, Wallace decided he wasn't going to do that. He wanted to expose the harsh reality of life in Manaus, and he felt like the only way to do that was to show everything. And so that year, he launched this show, which he called Canal Livre, which translates roughly to free channel. And true to form, there was no filter on what went on the air. And so this show was shocking. Viewers were given a front row seat to freshly murdered victims that are lying out in the road and slumped over chairs in restaurants and behind steering wheels. And the cameraman would zoom in on their fatal injuries, and they would zoom in on the faces of these people that have just died. Every gratuitous detail, every blood spatter, every grieving family member of the victim who's crying out in pain, all of it was shown on this TV show. And then, in between these very dark and violent segments about gang killings and drug deals gone wrong, Canal Livre also had a much lighter side. They would bring on local artists to talk about what they're working on, to maybe try to sell some of their goods. The show would also focus on down-on-their-luck families that needed help raising some money, and so the show was designed to get people to donate. And then also, for really no reason at all, there was a segment on the show where this puppet character would get into a fight with a man selling bread. It was a totally bizarre and shocking spectacle, and the people of Manaus loved it. And then eventually, the people of Brazil loved it. I mean, this was an extremely popular show. Because Wallace was often on camera on Canal Livre, he became very famous and very recognizable. And so when he would walk around Manaus, people would see him and literally just start clapping and cheering for him. And as he and his show became more and more popular across South America, Wallace decided he didn't just want to report on crime, he wanted to fight crime. So, on air, Wallace began berating the government for not being able to protect its citizens, and he berated the police for not being able to catch the criminals. And then off the air, Wallace campaigned for and was elected to political office in Manaus, where he continued to push hard to reduce crime in the city. And so it wasn't long before Wallace went from just being a relatively well-known TV host to being one of the most beloved and influential and trustworthy people in all of Brazil. However, over the years, there was one strange thing about his show, Canal Livre, that people just couldn't wrap their heads around. This oddity was most obvious in a now famous episode of Canal Livre that aired sometime in the mid-2000s. This episode opens with a Canal Livre reporter making their way through a jungle, and there's a cameraman filming them from behind. And this reporter, they're very carefully walking through, kind of pushing branches out of the way and high-stepping over all the underbrush. And then at some point up ahead, you see there is a clearing, and there is a third person standing in this clearing, and they're clearly looking straight down at something on the ground that we can't see. But this third person is very occupied with whatever is on the ground. And so eventually, this reporter makes their way through the jungle into this clearing, and then as soon as the cameraman gets into the clearing as well, he looks down at what is on the ground. And what you see is what appears to be a log that has previously been lit on fire because it's still smoking and it's black and it's charred. But as the cameraman zooms in, you see there are hands on this log. So you realize it's not a log, it's a human being who's obviously deceased. And based on how badly charred they are and how much they're still smoking, you realize very quickly that this person must have been on fire very recently as probably just a couple of minutes ago. Like right before the camera got here, this person was on fire. And so as you're kind of seeing this shocking image, the reporter suddenly talks about this person like he knows all the details of them already. He says, this person, it's a man, and they were not shot to death, they were doused with gasoline and burned alive. But at this point, the police had not come out. They had not seen this dead person yet. And so it made no sense that the reporter would have all this information on hand because no one knows this stuff yet. And based on just looking at this person's body, it was too badly burned to be able to tell whether it was a man or whether they had been shot or not or whether gasoline was used. But when Wallace was questioned about where he and his reporters got their information from, he just said, look, we're a very popular show and people call us often before they call the police and they give us information about what's happening in the city. And we have a huge team. We watch the police headquarters, we listen to the police's radio, we watch the morgue, we have loads of informants all over the city. And so we just get our information really, really quickly. And this answer was enough until 2008. That year, in October, the police arrested a former Manaus police officer who just went by the name Moa, and they accused him of 9 murders. And so they throw him in jail, but Moa, despite the seriousness of the charges against him, seems totally unfazed. It was obvious he had some sort of powerful connection outside of prison, some person or some entity that he fully expected was going to, at any moment, swoop in and magically get him out of prison. But that didn't happen. Moa just continued to sit in jail, and at some point that began to sink in that he was kind of on his own, and so he began to talk. And the story he would tell would shock Brazil. Moa would admit to having killed some people, but he would tell police, look, I'm just the assassin. The person who hired me for these killings is Wallace Souza. It would turn out Wallace Souza started his show, Canal Livre, with the best of intentions. But when his show became massively popular and it in turn made him, Wallace, also massively popular and powerful, he became corrupt. And at some point after his meteoric rise, he formed this very powerful drug cartel, and then in an effort to bolster his illegal dealings and to boost his show's ratings, he decided to start contracting hitmen like Moa to start taking out rival gang members in Manaus. And he would tell the hitman how he wanted them killed and where he wanted them killed and at what time. And then after the hitman agreed to do this, he, Wallace, would go tell his camera crews exactly where to go and at what time so that they would be arriving at the murder scene literally right as it was happening or right afterwards, allowing them the opportunity to get all the gory footage before anybody else. It would take the police a year to finally compile enough evidence to charge Wallace with murder, but they would do it in October of 2009, and eventually Wallace would turn himself in. However, he denied everything. And then before he went to trial, he would die of a heart attack in prison. And so we never actually got to learn the full extent of what exactly Wallace Souza had done, how many people he had assassinated, and how many of them were shown on his TV show. But we do know that at least 3 of his assassination victims were shown on his TV show, one of them being the person that was found out in the jungle. They really were a man. They really had not been shot. They had been burned alive with gasoline at Wallace's discretion. But in the end, the person who paid the highest price for the Canal Livre killings was Moa, the hitman who blew the whistle on what was going on with the show. On New Year's Day in 2017, a crime syndicate overran the prison where Moa was being held. Now, they had lots of targets of people they were going there to kill, and one of them was Moa. They were furious with him that he spoke to police and gave up information about the drug trade in Brazil. And so eventually, this angry mob of gangsters made their way over to Moa's cell, and when they found him, he was pressed up against the back of his cell wall, basically as far away from the bars as he possibly could be, and he began pleading for his life, and this horde was not having it. They were only there to kill him. And so they all have machetes and knives, and they're looking at him through the bars, and they say, we're going to come in there, we're going to cut you to pieces. And so then they start banging on the door, they're trying to hack the lock open, and Moa, he can't do anything. All he can do is kind of just keep himself all the way to the back of the cell and hope they don't get in. And eventually, they can't open the door, and they know it. And so they do the next best thing. They reach through the bars with a lighter and they light Moa's mattress on fire. And so Moa was trapped. He had nowhere to go, and so eventually the fire reached him and he burned alive. The next and final story of today's episode is called Inside a Nigerian Death Factory. In Nigeria, motorcycle taxi drivers are called Okadas, and in Ibadan, which is one of Nigeria's biggest cities, home to 3.5 million people, there are a lot of Okadas. However, despite their massive numbers, these Ibadan Okadas are actually a fairly tight-knit community made up primarily of young men. And so in early 2014, when 2 of these Okadas went missing, the community immediately found out about it and was really concerned. And when the police did not appear to be doing much to actually go out and find these 2 guys, the community of Okadas decided to launch a search of their own. Basically, as they went about their day, driving around the city, dropping fares off, all of these Okadas would be going down side streets and looking in back alleys and checking all over the city for their missing members. But despite their best efforts, they never could find them. Then, on March 22nd of that year, a 3rd Ibadan Okada vanished. He was a young man named Lanre Sidiku, and unlike the other 2 riders who went missing while they were at home, Lanre went missing while he was working. Lanre was part of a group of Okadas within the city who all kind of met up on the same city street, and that's where they stayed throughout the course of their day, trying to wave down fares as they came up. And so everyone in that meetup point all knew each other, and so they all knew Lanre. And on the day he went missing, they recalled seeing him driving away from this meetup point with 2 passengers on the back of his bike. Now, typically, the rides these Okadas would offer to their passengers were very short. They're only driving them just around the city. And so it was very quickly noticed that Lanre had left and after several hours had still not come back yet. When it was noticed by the other Okadas, they began talking about it and someone said, give him a call, make sure he's okay. And so they called his cell phone and Lanre did not pick up, which was highly unusual, not just for Lanre, but amongst the other Okadas. They always had their phones on because they're looking for new customers and customers could be calling them. And so their cell phone is a vital part of their work. And so his phone is off, they don't really know what to make of that, and then out of nowhere, Lanre actually calls this group of riders. However, he was calling them on his second cell phone. Lanre would keep a work phone and a personal phone, so he was calling them on his personal phone. And so when this other Okada answered the phone and heard Lanre's voice, he put the phone on speaker so the others who were concerned could hear what was going on. And what they heard was Lanre, totally hysterical, screaming into the phone that he needed help. He said that he and 8 other people he was with, who he didn't even know, had been kidnapped, and their kidnappers had brought them to this underground prison cell. They couldn't see anything, but they could hear people walking above them. Lanre also explained that when they had been kidnapped, the captors had taken all of their belongings, but they hadn't recognized that Lanre had this secondary cell phone, which is why he was calling from it. And so in between Lanre's frantic descriptions of what was going on and what had happened to him, these Okadas that received this call, they can hear in the background these other 8 people that are with Lanre in this underground cell screaming out as loud as they can, probably to get the attention of someone, anyone who was above ground who might be able to come down and save them. And so these Okada riders who are getting this call from Lanre, they're horrified, and they're trying to calm Lanre down so he can explain where he is so they can go find him. And finally, Lanre, he does compose himself, and he gives them really specific directions to this footpath that led into the Soka forest where he said he had been taken. The Soka forest was a very dense stretch of wilderness right on the outskirts of Ibadan. Lanre would tell them that he had no idea where specifically in the Soka forest he was. However, he said, if you just keep walking on that path, eventually you'll hear us calling out from underground and you can come and save us. And so as the riders turned on their bikes and they got ready to head out and go rescue their friend, they told Lanre to stay on the line. Let us keep talking to you until we find you. But as they're telling him that, his phone abruptly cuts out. And then when they tried calling him back, his phone was off. About 40 Okadas from Lanre's meetup spot took off together and sped down city streets until they hit this major highway that would take them out of the city. And then once they were out of the city, they went down this other road that brought them right towards the Soka forest. And then as this road put them right up against the tree line on their left side of the Soka forest, they all began looking for the 2 burned out cars that Lanre had said marked the beginning of this footpath they were looking for. And so sure enough, they find these burned out cars, they park all their bikes off on the shoulder of the road, and they quickly realize that this really is a footpath only. There's no way they can get their motorcycles onto the path, not only because the burned out cars are blocking their way, but because the path itself is so overgrown with vegetation. I mean, they can barely see the path, let alone drive something through it. And so the men leave their bikes by the side of the road, and then unarmed, they walk past the burned out cars onto this path, and then because it was so narrow, they had to walk more or less in a single file line into the Soka forest. And so as these men are basically marching into the woods, they're not making any sound, because again, they're trying to listen for the sound of their friend and the other people that have been taken captive somewhere underground. And so they're silently marching through this forest when all of a sudden, the guy at the front of the line thinks he hears something way up ahead. And so he holds his hand up to stop the line, and they all stop and they're trying to listen. And then all of a sudden, about 50 feet ahead of them through the trees, this man they didn't recognize suddenly jumped out from behind a tree. He yelled something at them, and then he raised his gun and began firing in their direction. The 40 Okadas immediately turn around and just sprint back down the path, right back out to the road. They hop on their bikes and they peel back out towards the city. When they finally get back to the meetup spot they had all originated from, they realize they can't just leave Lanre and the other people he was with out to dry. They have to go back and rescue them. They considered calling the police, but given the lackluster response to the other 2 missing Okadas, they realized they probably would have a higher chance of saving their friend and the others if they just went themselves. And so the 40 Okadas rounded up another 60 from other neighboring meetup spots, and this huge posse of over 100 men all hopped on their bikes and headed back towards that footpath that led into the forest. When they got there, they put their bikes on the side of the road, and this time, when they started walking down that path, they had guns, knives, bats, all sorts of weapons, and they were not trying to be quiet. They were actually yelling like these loud war cries to let the gunmen and any other gunmen in the woods know that there was a horde of angry people that were coming into the woods for a fight. And so as they're marching down this trail, kind of expecting to get shot at any point, it doesn't happen. Instead, after quite a while, they walk out of the thick forest into this huge opening. And right in the middle of this huge clearing is this fairly small river, but it's big enough that it would be very difficult to cross. However, they can see there's a bridge, this kind of crumbling old stone bridge that goes over this river. And then on the other side of the bridge, on the other side of the river, they can see there are 2 dilapidated buildings. The one that is closer to the bridge is this small black shack that has a window looking out towards them. And from their perspective, they're maybe 100 feet away from this shack. They can't tell if anybody's inside of this building. And then the other building was much bigger than the shack. It was this huge kind of broken down warehouse that had big, tall cement walls. And then all around it was this huge chain link fence with barbed wire wrapped around the tops. And so this huge posse of Okadas, they come storming out of the forest and they run over to that bridge, which is the one way across. And as they get on the bridge, they're kind of scanning the 2 buildings. They're not seeing anybody. And then one of the men, they look down underneath the bridge and they actually see Lanre's motorcycle. It's lying on the banks of this river, kind of tucked up underneath the bridge as if someone had stolen it. And so everyone already knows Lanre is somewhere over here. We're going to go find him. And so the men, they get over the bridge, they go to that first building, that black shack, and they open up the door. It's a plywood door, and there's no one inside. But the shack is literally stuffed full of hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing and shoes. And so after kind of looking this over and not really sure what to make of it, the posse moved on from the black shack and made their way up to the fence right in front of this huge warehouse. And when they reached the fence, they're kind of expecting to be met with some sort of resistance. I mean, the last time they were out here, they got shot at. And so they begin yelling into the warehouse for anyone in there to show yourselves, come out here. But it was silent. And so one of the Okadas that was part of the posse had brought along bolt cutters as a weapon to use as a club if he needed to. But as it happened, he began to use the bolt cutters for their actual purpose, and he bent down and actually cut a huge hole in this fence so they could go in and explore this warehouse. And so after a large percentage of this posse had gotten inside the fence line, they began walking around this huge warehouse to try to find an entrance inside. And so as they're walking, the windows that lead into this warehouse, they're too high up, so you can't actually see what's going on inside. It's silent, there's a pretty bad smell, but they don't really know what to make of this. They walk around the structure, and when they get to the very back, they find an entrance. All it is this big rusted piece of tin metal, like sheet metal, that's propped up against a gap in the walls of the warehouse. And so one of the Okadas grabs this piece of metal and he pushes it out of the way. And then as soon as he did that, a few other Okadas quickly stepped through the threshold into the warehouse, preparing themselves to have to fight potentially if there are gunmen or anybody else inside that might want to do them harm. But as soon as they see what is inside of this warehouse, they immediately lower their weapons and just stare in abject horror. According to the locals who lived actually in the forest relatively near where this warehouse was, they said there was actually another way to get to this particular area, to get to the warehouse. There was another path that was very rough, but it was big enough for one vehicle that came in from the other direction. Now, the locals said they didn't use this path at all. They didn't even know where it originated from. But they said for the last 10 years or more, they have seen one vehicle use this road all the time to get to the warehouse. And it was this black Jeep with black tinted out windows, and they said it would typically show up most nights of the week around 8 p.m. And they said it would just go down the road, it would make its way over to the warehouse area, and then around 9:30 p.m., they would hear or see the black Jeep leaving. Now, none of the locals knew who was driving this Jeep, although they knew it was a man. That was really all they knew. And they had no idea what this man did when he got over near the warehouse. However, for the last 10 years, every time this guy was over near the warehouse from 8 to 9:30 at night, they would typically hear screams coming from that part of the woods, coming from the warehouse. And when the locals brought their concerns to police, the police just kind of blew it off and didn't do anything about it and actually told the people, don't worry about it. And so over the years, the locals had kind of just accepted that this man in his black Jeep and the screams coming from this warehouse were just a part of life. And so no one even reported it anymore. Had the police followed up on the locals' concerns about this Jeep and the screams, they would have discovered that that warehouse was actually a storage facility for a very in-demand and very illegal product. And that man who drove that black Jeep, he would take this illegal product and he would bring it back with him in batches and he would sell it on the black market. When this posse of 100+ Okadas pulled that metal door aside and they stepped into the warehouse, they were not met with any resistance. Anyone that had been there, any other gunmen or guards or anything like that, they had fled when they heard the sound of this massive posse whooping and yelling on their way in. And so as these Okadas are standing inside of the structure surveying what's in front of them, the first thing they noticed is right in the middle of the structure on the ground is this cement slab. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet, and one corner of this slab was elevated slightly by some rocks that had been placed under it, kind of propping it up, pitching it on an angle. And then just off of the side of the lowest point of the slab was this wooden bowl that had dark stains inside of it that was positioned in such a way that if you put water on the slab, the water would drain off of that corner directly into this bowl. Basically, it was there to catch any runoff from whatever was happening on this slab. Around this cement slab, all over the dirt floor, were bones, some with meat on them. And then beyond the bones and beyond the slab, all around the perimeter of the inside of this building were extremely malnourished, catatonic people chained up to the walls. These people were the highly in-demand, highly illegal product. More specifically, their body parts were the product. In Nigeria, a stunning number of people believe that certain magic potions and charms will grant you wealth and success, and in some cases, infinite life. But the catch is, the herbalists who will perform the magical rituals and give these potions and charms to people that pay for them, they often require human body parts for them to work. And so human body part factories, like this warehouse in Soka Forest, were established in order to meet the high demand of people that needed these parts. And so the way it's believed it worked at the Soka Forest warehouse was the man in the black Jeep. He would get orders from people that wanted specific body parts for their magical potions and charms and whatever else they needed, and he would make a list of those parts, and then at 8 p.m. he would show up at the warehouse and he would communicate with the people that worked at that warehouse, and they would determine out of all the captives they had who had the parts they needed, and then after figuring out which captives were going to be used that night, they would go into the main section of the warehouse, and one by one, they would unchain these people, they would drag them to the center of the room, and in full view of all the other captives, they would put them on the slab, known as the slaughtering slab, and they would hack off the required body parts. And they would bag them up, put them in coolers, and then the man with the black Jeep, he would take those parts and he would leave. And then the person who's just been butchered, if they were still alive and might have a chance of surviving, they'd just be brought back to the wall and chained up again. If they did not have a good chance of survival, then they'd be brought to the very back of the warehouse in the back rooms where they would be discarded. Now, the means of execution varied, but in the back rooms of this warehouse, they found a makeshift guillotine, which cuts off people's heads, and they also found a large crocodile that was chained up. And so it's likely that those were at least two of the methods used to discard of the people they could no longer harvest organs from. After the Okadas kind of broke out of their initial shock of what they were seeing inside of this warehouse, they went around and began freeing people that were still chained up to the walls. And in total, there were 23 people that were still barely alive, still inside of this warehouse, but none of them were Lanre Sadiku. And then after checking all of the dead bodies and body parts that were inside of the warehouse, and then also right outside, where there were a number of shallow mass graves, they couldn't find Lanre amongst them either. And so this huge posse began looking all over the property for an entrance to this underground prison that Lanre had described being in. But they couldn't find it, and so eventually this posse made their way back over to the survivors who were being tended to by locals that had come over, and they asked the survivors, are you aware of any underground prison cells somewhere around here where other people were being held? But the survivors either didn't know or just were unable to speak anymore. And so later that day, when the police did come out because word got out about this huge find out in this forest, the posse went to the police and begged them to please begin digging up this entire property. We need to find the entrance to this underground prison cell. Lanre and 8 others, and who knows how many others beyond them, are trapped underground in these cells, and we gotta get to them. But the police just kind of refused and immediately just demolished the warehouse. And then after kind of cordoning off that area for a couple of days, the police basically just left and stopped caring about it altogether. And so the Okadas once again came together as a community and would spend the next several weeks going back out to this forest and just manually begin digging up all over this entire property in hopes of finding their friend and the rest of these people that were trapped underground. But they never did. And so we don't know what happened to Lanre and the other people who were trapped in that underground cell. We don't know what happened to the other 2 Okada riders who went missing right before Lanre did, although it's generally assumed they most likely were kidnapped as well and probably met a similar fate. We also have no idea how many people were butchered inside of the Soka Forest warehouse. However, given the massive amount of clothing and shoes inside of that black shack, it's believed the total number of victims is easily in the hundreds. No one has ever been officially held accountable for the atrocities that took place in the Soka Forest. However, a couple of days after the warehouse was discovered by the Okada posse, the posse was back digging, looking for Lanre, when they discovered there was this man who was there who was kind of walking around acting suspicious, and so the posse confronted him, and it would turn out this guy had several human tongues in his pockets, along with dozens and dozens of cell phone SIM cards. And so, assuming he was part of whatever happened there, the Okada posse proceeded to kill the man on sight. Later on, a woman who was a survivor from the warehouse would tell reporters how she got kidnapped. She said she lived in Ibadan, she was well educated, she had a good family, she was just sitting outside of her house when all of a sudden this van pulled up in front of her, and these very official looking men were inside of this van, and they got out and they told her, you're under arrest, you gotta come with us to the police station. And the woman was so confused, but the men were very professional and seemed very convincing, and so she got inside the van, they shut the door, and they drove off. And very quickly, once she was inside of the van and couldn't go anywhere, she realized they were not police, she had been kidnapped, and within the hour, she, along with several other people who had probably been kidnapped in the same way, were stripping their clothes off right outside of that black shack on the other side of the river, and they were told to put their clothes and belongings inside of the shack while they were being held at gunpoint, and then once they were naked, they were promptly marched into that warehouse where virtually everyone around her would be butchered and killed. At 10:30 p.m. on June 2, 2000, 15-year-old Heather Robinson heard her family's landline telephone ring, and so she picked it up. But before she could even say hello, she heard her father saying hello to whoever had called them. He had picked up the other telephone upstairs in his room. Heather was about to hang up, but she got curious when she heard the tense tone of the person her father was speaking to. And so she decided to just mute her handset and secretly listen to her dad's conversation. What she would hear over the next 45 seconds would not only change her life forever, but it would make headlines all over the world. This story includes sexual content and some graphic violence. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please remove the pressure plate from underneath the 5-star review button's Enter key on their keyboard. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. For 19-year-old Lisa Stasi, the Christmas of 1984 was the worst she could remember. And that was really saying something, because even though Lisa was still very young, she had been through a lot. Born in the city of Huntsville, Alabama, whose 143,000 residents lived in the northernmost part of the state, best known as the Heart of Dixie, Lisa's father had died when she was just a child, and her brother would commit suicide. And so, after dropping out of high school at the age of 17, the beautiful teenager with the bright smile decided to leave Huntsville, her broken family, and her sad memories behind, and head for the metropolitan glamour and polish of Kansas City, Kansas, 670 miles to the northwest. But 2 years after that great escape, here she was, in the middle of a cold Midwest winter, in the middle of a collapsed marriage that had lasted only 1 year. In many ways, Lisa was worse off now than she'd been back in Alabama. She had no money, she had no job skills, and she had no home. But the one thing Lisa did have that made her happier than anything else in her life was her tiny 4-month-old daughter, Tiffany. Back when Lisa had arrived in Kansas City in 1983 and met her future husband, Carl, at a bar, she hadn't intended to get pregnant, but shortly after being introduced to the handsome 23-year-old sailor, the two of them had fallen in love, and the rest, as Lisa's mother would say, was history. Just 1 month after the young couple got married in August of 1984, little Tiffany Lynn was born on September 4th at a hospital on the Missouri side of Kansas City. But right after that, things started going downhill. By October, Carl was out of the Navy and out of work, and according to Lisa's friends and family, their marriage had turned violent. 2 months later, just a few days after Christmas, Carl would leave Lisa and Tiffany and he would rejoin the military. With nowhere to go, Lisa and her baby moved into Hope House, which was a local shelter for homeless women. But just 1 month after that horrible Christmas, Lisa got the break she had been praying for. In the beginning of January 1985, the director of Hope House told Lisa that a local philanthropist had contacted the shelter saying that his newly founded charitable organization called Kansas City Outreach had heard about Lisa's plight and wanted to help her. Kansas City Outreach looked specifically for mothers with infants who needed housing and job training, and so Lisa was a perfect fit. Through their program, Lisa would be given her own furnished apartment and an $800 monthly allowance, along with some babysitting money. Lisa was thrilled. A few days after learning about this program and agreeing to be a part of it, Lisa had packed up all of her belongings and she had driven to her sister-in-law's house, where someone from the program was going to come and pick Lisa and her baby up and take them to their new apartment. As Lisa waited, she felt annoyed that her sister-in-law, Kathy, was not as excited about this opportunity as she was. In fact, Kathy was acting like this whole thing seemed kind of sketchy, that the Kansas City Outreach program was just too good to be true. And as a heavy snowstorm moved into the area that day, Kathy suggested in a hopeful voice that maybe the weather would keep her ride from being able to drive out to pick her up that day, and that maybe Lisa would have another day or two to decide if she really wanted to go through with this. But Lisa shrugged her off, and a little while later, right at the appointed hour, the two women heard a knock on the front door. And when they opened it, to their surprise, the founder of the Kansas City Outreach program was there. He was a smiling, well-dressed, middle-aged man in a long trench coat. And after introducing himself, he walked back to the car and stood there ready to open the car door for Lisa. Lisa carefully wrapped her baby, Tiffany, in her warmest blanket and tucked her into the car seat that was sitting near the front door. Then Lisa said goodbye to her sister-in-law, and then she picked up the car seat and shielded Tiffany from the snow as she walked quickly down the front steps and out to the waiting car. She strapped her infant into the back seat, then Lisa slid into the front passenger seat where she buckled up and then waved and smiled at Kathy as the car pulled away from the curb. Over the next several weeks, Lisa, who normally spoke with her mother all the time, stopped calling. Concerned, Lisa's mother contacted the Kansas City police, and the police asked her if, besides phone calls, had she had any other interactions with her daughter recently, and Lisa's mother would hesitate, but would say yes, she had. Not long after Lisa's calls had stopped, Lisa's mother had received a typewritten note from Lisa that had her daughter's signature written out at the bottom that claimed Lisa was doing just fine and that she didn't need anything, but there was just something odd about the way the note was written. It just didn't sound like Lisa at all. 8 years later, in 1993, a 48-year-old woman named Beverly Bonner stood looking around the prison library at the Western Missouri Correctional Center in Cameron, a little town of 8,500 residents located in the northwest corner of Missouri. When Beverly had gotten her advanced degrees in teaching and librarianship back in college, she had never expected to find herself in charge of a prison library, especially after spending more than a decade as an executive with the Mobil Oil Company back in the 1970s and 80s in Kansas City. But a lot had changed for Beverly over the last 20 years. She'd had 2 children and had gone through 1 divorce before marrying her current husband, who happened to be the prison doctor at the Western Missouri Correctional Center. Beverly was grateful that she'd been hired as the prison librarian, but as she looked around at the perfectly organized collection of books on the shelves, she wished that her job was a little more challenging and that her marriage to Dr. William, now in its 6th year, was a little bit more exciting. Except that recently, very recently, Beverly's life had gotten a little bit more interesting. As she heard the metal door into the library open, Beverly felt her pulse quicken. She knew it was her new library assistant, a prison inmate whose exemplary behavior and high level of education had qualified him for this plum assignment inside the library. And when she'd first been introduced to him several weeks ago, it turned out that, amazingly, she'd actually met him before, back in 1970, when he also had worked at Mobil Oil in Kansas City as a systems analyst. Back then, there had been some gossip surrounding the circumstances under which he had been fired from Mobil, But even in the short period of time that she'd spent with him there at the library, it had become clear to Beverly that whatever had happened at Mobile, just like the fraud charges that had landed him here in prison, could not have been his fault. As he walked toward her now, eyes twinkling and that boyish grin on his face, Beverly felt her face flush as his eyes traveled up and down her body. Then, when he reached her, he leaned in close and he told her how very, very good she looked. Beverly's affair with her library assistant had begun almost immediately after he had started working with her, and by the time his prison sentence was over 6 months later, Beverly's lover had promised her an exciting role in the new business he planned to build as soon as he was on the outside. Not only would this new business make both of them rich, but Beverly believed this would finally be a career that challenged her. And it came with lots of international travel, so Beverly was really excited. And so in 1994, a few months after her lover's release, Beverly divorced her second husband, Dr. William, and got a property settlement from him for $18,000. Then she sent her kids off to live with Dr. Bonner, and then she left Missouri and headed off to Olathe, Kansas, to join her prison lover and start this new and exotic life with him. But when Beverly's oldest child died a little over 1 year later, in December of 1995, Beverly didn't show up for his funeral. In fact, it had been more than 12 months since anyone had seen Beverly in person. The only communication anyone in her family had had with her since she left for Olathe, Kansas, were a few typewritten letters she had sent that had her signature at the bottom. But no matter how many times the family read these letters to reassure themselves that everything was okay with Beverly, they couldn't help but think that the language she had chosen to use in these letters sounded totally weird. It just did not sound like her. 6 years later, on a cold night in late January 2000, 28-year-old Suzette Troughton was sitting inside her apartment in Monroe, Michigan, a town of 22,000 people located in the southeast corner of the Great Lakes state. She was doing what she did almost every night, talking on the phone with her mom, Carolyn, who also lived in Monroe. While they talked, Suzette petted Pika and Harry, the two tiny Pekingese dogs that were her constant companions. Outside her apartment window were the familiar streets of her hometown, the place where she had been born and where her parents had gone through a nasty divorce and where she had dropped out of high school in her junior year. But despite all that, Suzette actually liked living in Monroe. And overall, she liked her job as a nurse's aide, where she mostly took care of elderly and terminally ill patients. She was actually so good at her job that she wanted to get her degree in nursing, but money was tight. Just to pay for the few nursing prep courses she was taking right now, she had to pick up a part-time waitressing job at Bob's Big Boy restaurant. So, when Suzette had found this amazing job offer online 5 months ago in the fall of 1999, she could hardly believe her luck. A well-to-do businessman in Kansas City was looking for a healthcare worker to come with him and his elderly father on a round-the-world cruise on his yacht. In exchange for taking care of his dad, the man was offering to pay all living expenses plus an annual salary of $65,000, 3 times what Suzette made working her 2 jobs in Monroe. But ever since she had accepted this job offer, her mother and some of Suzette's closest friends had voiced real concerns, saying that the opportunity just seemed way too good to be true. And sure enough, on that cold night in January of 2000, that's what Suzette's mom was talking to her about on the phone. And per usual, Suzette told her mom to stop worrying. Suzette knew her future employer was totally legit. The previous October, she'd contacted him to get more details about the job, and he'd paid for her to fly down to Kansas City for a week just to meet him and discuss the job. He'd sent a limousine to pick her up at the airport, and he'd put her up in a nice motel for 5 days. He also showed her the mansion where he lived, and he showed her a furnished apartment in a section of Kansas City called Overlook Park, where she could live when they weren't off visiting Hawaii, the Far East, and Europe. And once it was time for Suzette to move from Monroe to Kansas City on February 11th, 2000, her employer had said he would be renting a small truck for her to drive so she could bring her 2 dogs and some of her belongings along with her. Because no matter how sweet the offer was, Suzette had stressed that she could never go anywhere without her Pika and Harry. A few minutes later, the phone conversation with her mother wrapped up, and Suzette said goodnight and that she would call again tomorrow. After hanging up the phone, Suzette turned to the computer in her small living room. A minute later, she was logged in to her favorite website where she spent the majority of her free time. The name of this website was the International Council of Masters, and it was fully and completely devoted to people like Suzette who were deep into the world and alternate lifestyle of BDSM. BDSM is an umbrella term that refers to a spectrum of sexual behaviors and preferences that can be divvied up into the groups of bondage and discipline, domination and submission, and sadism and masochism. Suzette was very close with her mother, and always had been, but this aspect of her life was something she kept secret. Suzette had multiple online BDSM relationships, and during the last several years, she had moved from the world of BDSM sex online to BDSM sex in person. And in a strange twist of fate, it was actually through BDSM that she had met her future employer, the wealthy Kansas City businessman. This man, whose online username was the Slave Master, had first reached out to Suzette in one of her BDSM chat rooms, and it was there that he actually offered her the $65,000 a year sail around the world on a yacht dream job. And so Suzette had obviously been very interested and asked him for more information, and in response, he had paid for her to come to Kansas to learn more. During those 5 days, Suzette spent a little time learning about the dream job and a lot of time being the slave master's slave. She had even signed his so-called slave contract, which said he had full control over her and could punish her however and whenever he wanted. For 5 days, the slave master filmed himself having his way with Suzette. And when Suzette had come back to Monroe, she would spend hours re-watching those videos, fantasizing about doing it all over again when she headed off to begin working for him. Finally, February 11th rolled around and it was time for Suzette to leave Monroe and head off to Kansas City. Suzette kissed her mom and other family members goodbye, she tucked Pika and Harry into their deluxe travel cases, and then she climbed into the truck that the slave master had rented for her, and then she began the 750-mile drive west to Kansas City. A few weeks later, on March 1st, from her motel room in Kansas City, Suzette sent a message on her computer to a fellow BDSM enthusiast to say that she and the slave master were finally leaving for their around-the-world yacht trip with her master's elderly father, and that she was really excited and that this experience was going to be a lot of fun. At 10:30 that morning, the slave master opened the door of Suzette's motel room and walked inside. He looked around, happy to see that Suzette had packed up the last of her things and was ready to go, but before they left, there was just one more thing he needed Suzette to do. He walked across the room and put the blank pieces of paper he had been holding down on a table, and then he gestured for Suzette to come over. He told her to sign her name at the bottom of each page. This way, he said, she'd be reminded to write some letters to her family once they were out at sea. He said he could even help her type some of the letters up since he'd be bringing along his typewriter. Suzette, who was a terrible speller and who preferred messaging on the computer over letter writing, thought this was a good idea. And after she'd signed her name to each page, she turned her attention to making sure that her dogs had finished their food and that they were snuggled down inside of their carrying case. A few minutes later, Suzette was in the car with the slave master on their way to pick up his father. But as they drove, the slave master suddenly turned to her and said, "Before we get my dad, I want to take you somewhere." He told her he wanted to show her a piece of farm property that he owned in Lynn County, which was just outside of Kansas City. Suzette grinned and said, "Okay," thinking her master must want one more sexual encounter before they set sail. And sure enough, after they had arrived at the single trailer on a deserted stretch of flat farmland 60 miles south of Olathe, the slave master parked the car, reached into the glove compartment, and pulled out a blindfold and a length of rope. Suzette smiled. She could tell by the expression on his face that he clearly had something very special planned for her. A few hours later, the slave master was back in his car, except this time he was alone, minus Suzette's 2 dogs who were whining in the back seat. The slave master wiped some sweat from his brow, then he fired up the car engine, pulled out of the dirt lot onto the road. Isn't it frustrating when you sit down to listen to your favorite true crime podcast and you can't get it to load because of slow connection speeds? I used to have that problem until I signed up with NordVPN. With their ultra-fast connection, I said goodbye to buffering and just enjoy my uninterrupted service even on multiple devices at once. Also, thanks to NordVPN's secure P2P servers, I can finally share large files with no hassle. NordVPN makes my life easy. It's simple and intuitive to use, yet their team of experts offers 24/7 support if I ever have a question. And with their latest feature, Threat Protection, NordVPN has taken cybersecurity to a whole other level. Threat Protection shields users from the dangers of an open network. It's constantly on the lookout for malicious sites, trackers, and even blocks those annoying pop-up ads, making browsing the internet as easy and fun as slapping the 5-star review button on the ears on a cold day. So, take control of your internet experience today. Right now, the best deal on NordVPN is through my special podcast offer. NordVPN is offering MrBallen podcast listeners an exclusive 2-year plan at a huge discount plus 1 additional month for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen podcast. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. One more time, that's nordvpn.com/MrBallen podcast, or click the link in the description. Some people are just naturally good at building beautiful, engaging websites to help grow their brand and audience. I, on the other hand, need a little help when it comes to things like that. So I rely on the all-in-one platform built for online businesses, Squarespace. Squarespace makes it easy for creators like myself to produce and highlight content in a way that fits my very own specific needs. The Squarespace Video Studio app helps me to effortlessly create pro-level videos that can be shared not only on my website, but with followers across all of my connected social media channels. Through Squarespace's analytics reporting, I can analyze and use insights to develop my business and take it to the next level. But my favorite Squarespace feature has to be the online booking and scheduling capabilities, which completely takes the hassle out of coordinating my calendar. So if you're like me and can use the help building your brand and growing your online business, Squarespace is definitely the way to go. Right now, I'm offering something truly special to all of my podcast listeners. Head on over to squarespace.com/MrBallen for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, be sure to use offer code MrBallen to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Once again, that's squarespace.com/MrBallen for your free trial and save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain with offer code MrBallen. Grow your business online with Squarespace. A few weeks later, Suzette's mother, Carolyn, would receive a typewritten letter in the mail from her daughter. And in this letter, her daughter would tell her how great the cruise was going so far. And at the bottom of the letter was her daughter's signature. But just like Lisa Stassi's family and Beverly Bonner's family, Carolyn and the rest of Suzette's family thought this letter just didn't seem right. It didn't sound like Suzette. But what made Suzette's family especially skeptical of this letter was that one of her dog's names had been badly misspelled. Not just a typo, but a full-blown misspelling. Suzette adored her dogs like they were her children, and she would never have spelled the dog's name that way. And so the combination of this egregious spelling error combined with the overall alien feel of the letter convinced Suzette's family that Suzette simply could not have been the letter's author. But the implications of this were not clear. Did this mean Suzette was in trouble? Was this letter just a prank? They didn't know. But they had no way of actually getting in touch with Suzette because she was out on this yacht, so there was no phone number for her. So with nothing else to do, the family just kind of began digging into Suzette's life to see if there was anything they could find. And her family quickly discovered that Suzette was a part of this BDSM community, but more importantly, they discovered that the Kansas City businessman who had offered Suzette this dream job was also a member of the BDSM community, and his username was the Slave Master. And when the family began reaching out to people in this community that had heard of the Slave Master, no one had nice things to say about him. And so at this discovery, Suzette's mother, Carolyn, just got this really bad feeling that something had happened to her daughter. And so she called the Kansas City police. And on this call, she would tell them that, she can't get in touch with her daughter, and she's gotten these letters from her daughter, but it doesn't sound like her. And then at the end of her initial story of what's going on with her daughter, she would tell the police that the last person she believed her daughter was with was her new employer, a man who called himself the slave master online. Now, at first, the police, as they're listening to Carolyn, they were a little bit dismissive of her story because it sounded like her adult daughter had chosen to go do something and she was sending letters, so she was in touch. So what was the big deal? But when they heard Carolyn mention the slave master part of the story, everything changed because the police knew exactly who the slave master was. A few months later, in the spring of 2000, 15-year-old Heather Robinson was sitting in her bedroom in her family's house in Chicago, Illinois, listening to her parents arguing downstairs. As she tossed her long brown hair over her shoulders, Heather was thinking to herself, did her parents really believe that she couldn't hear them fighting? And did they really think that over the last year she hadn't noticed that arguments like this one were becoming more and more frequent? It actually wasn't even the arguing that bothered Heather the most. It was the fact that her parents tried to act like these fights weren't even happening, like everything was just fine. And this totally annoyed and stressed Heather out. But the truth was, at the age of 15, everything bothered Heather, including the fact that she was an only child, and she didn't have any siblings to talk with about her parents going through this rough patch, and about how way overprotective her parents were. They had rules for everything, like not allowing her to take phone calls after 9 p.m., or telling her it was time to get off the family computer when she was mid-conversation with her friends. And with her 16th birthday and driver's license coming up that fall, she was sure they'd be making up even more rules for her. As she sat there wishing she had a little more independence, Heather suddenly remembered that offer her uncle had made her almost a year earlier. It was back when one of his 4 kids was getting married, and Heather and her parents, Donald and Frida Robinson, had flown down to Florida for her cousin's wedding. And after the wedding, during the big reception, Heather's uncle had pulled her out onto the dance floor. Heather didn't know her uncle very well. He and his wife lived 6 hours away from them, and her uncle was 10 years older than her own father, so the two brothers hadn't really grown up together. And except for special occasions like this wedding, they really only got together once a year at an annual family reunion. Now, as Heather recalled that actual dance with her uncle, she shuddered. Her uncle, who had been drinking at the reception, had suddenly gotten way too close to her, kind of rubbing up against her. However, just as quickly as he had started doing that, he had stopped, and then taking hold of one of her arms and said, it looks like things are kind of rough right now with your parents, and if you ever need to get away, you can just message me and I'll buy you a plane ticket and you can come out and visit me, no questions asked, just a little getaway. Then he squeezed her arm one more time, he gave her a nod, and then he walked away. At the time, Heather had not been remotely interested in this offer. But now, as she sat there staring out at the dark, cold night, listening to her mom and dad argue downstairs, she started to think maybe she should go visit her uncle. Maybe some time away would be a good thing. A few weeks later, at 10:30 p.m. on Friday, June 2nd, Heather listened from her bedroom for the sound of her parents retreating to their room. Once she was sure they were both in there, Heather quietly slipped out of her bedroom and headed downstairs to be closer to the landline telephone. She was expecting a call from a friend, but since it was after 9 p.m., she was not allowed to take calls. And so her plan was just to stand right in front of the phone and grab it the second it rang so it didn't wake up her parents, who had a phone right next to their bed. But when the phone actually rang just a few minutes later, Heather was fast, but not fast enough. By the time she'd picked up the receiver and put it to her ear, she could hear her father's sleepy voice already saying, "Hello?" Immediately, Heather pressed mute on her own handset, but instead of hanging up the phone, Heather hesitated. She could hear on the phone not her friend who was supposed to be calling, but one of her relatives, and his voice was low and very tense. Intrigued, Heather put the phone back to her ear and secretly listened. What Heather would hear in the next 45 seconds would change her life forever and make headlines all over the world. A few months earlier, when Suzette's mother, Carolyn, had called the Kansas City police and told them about how her daughter might be in trouble and that the last person she thought she had been with was this slave master person, the police instantly knew the man she was talking about because they were already investigating him. Several women in the BDSM community had come forward with complaints against this man. Most of the women had said they had met up with the slave master in person and he had assaulted them or stolen from them. So the police were confident that this slave master guy was a really bad guy. And so when Carolyn said her daughter, Suzette, had been with him last, and now no one could get in touch with Suzette and didn't know where she was, this sent up huge red flags for the police. But what pushed their suspicions over the edge was when, a couple of days later, Carolyn got a call from Olathe, Kansas Animal Control saying they had just found her daughter's beloved Pekingese dogs alive but abandoned in a trailer park. Carolyn knew her daughter would never abandon those dogs willingly, and so she called the Kansas City police back to tell them. When the police heard about the dogs, not only that Suzette was not with them, which was highly unusual according to her mother, but that the dogs were found in the same trailer park where they knew the slave master lived, they knew this could not be a coincidence. And so, on the morning of Friday, June 2nd, just 12 hours before 15-year-old Heather Robinson overheard that fateful phone conversation, the police in Kansas descended on the trailer park where the slave master lived. Federal, state, and local law enforcement would search not only the slave master's house, but also his 17-acre piece of farmland 60 miles to the south and several storage units he had rented in Raymore, Missouri, 30 miles to the west. In his house, investigators would quickly find Suzette's ID cards, as well as some blank stationery with her signatures written out at the bottom. They also found a receipt from 1985 for a motel room rented in Kansas City to a 19-year-old woman named Lisa Stassi. But these discoveries were nothing compared to what was found next. On the slave master's farmland were 3 85-gallon oil drums hidden next to the single shabby trailer. Inside of these drums, investigators found the bodies of 2 women who had died of puncture wounds to their skull, likely caused by a hammer. One of the bodies belonged to a 21-year-old Polish immigrant from Indiana who had been one of the slave master's slaves. The other was 28-year-old Suzette Troughton. She was found wearing a blindfold and had a piece of rope tied around her neck. Out at the slave master's storage facility in Raymore, Missouri, investigators found that one of the units had been rented back in 1994 under the name of former prison librarian Beverly Bonner. Inside that unit, they found 3 storage containers. One of them had Beverly Bonner's body inside of it, and the others held 2 more victims the slave master had recruited for sex, a 45-year-old mother and her 15-year-old disabled daughter who had been confined to a wheelchair. That night, at around 10:30 p.m., just hours before the public would find out the identity of the slave master, 15-year-old Heather Robinson picked up the phone and heard her father give a sleepy hello to whoever had called. Heather quickly muted her handset, but decided to secretly listen to her father's conversation. The low, tense voice of the person on the other line belonged to the son-in-law of her father's older brother, John Robinson. John was the uncle that Heather had danced with just a few months earlier at the wedding, who had been somewhat inappropriate with her and then kind of abruptly offered to fly her out to visit with him anytime she wanted. In a hushed and terrified voice, the son-in-law delivered the news that would start appearing in the newspapers and on the TV the next day. John had just been arrested for murder. Heather was so shocked by what she had just heard that she didn't really hear anything else the son-in-law said. However, before the son-in-law hung up, Heather remembered him saying that John was connected to several women, one of which was a woman named Lisa Stassi. Heather eventually hung up the phone, and then she took a deep breath, and she walked up the stairs and then walked down the hallway to her parents' bedroom, and when she pushed open the door, she saw her normally stoic father sobbing into his hands. Next to him, her mother was staring straight ahead with a shocked and frozen look on her ashen face. Heather had 2 questions. Is it really true that Uncle John killed someone? And who is Lisa Stassi? It would turn out Heather's uncle, John Robinson, was the slave master, which meant Heather's uncle was a serial killer. But this revelation was not the most shocking thing that Heather would learn that night. The most shocking thing had to do with Lisa Stasi. 15 years earlier, back in January of 1985, Heather's uncle, John, was the man who had driven through the snowstorm to pick up 19-year-old Lisa Stasi and her baby to take them to their new apartment that his program was going to pay for. But instead of bringing her to this new apartment, John brought Lisa and her baby to the Roadway Inn Motel in Overlook Park, Kansas City, and once there, he somehow convinced Lisa, like he would do with all of his other victims, to sign a blank piece of stationery. This would allow him to write letters to the victims' families as if they were letters written by the victim, because their signature was at the bottom. He hoped this tactic would keep the police off of his back. After Lisa had signed these papers, John killed her. As for Lisa's baby, John simply executed his plan. For years, John's brother, Donald, and his wife, Frida, who were Heather's parents, had been trying to adopt a child, but they had been unsuccessful. And so during this very stressful time, John had told them that in the course of his work as a philanthropist, he would sometimes get leads on babies who were up for adoption, and if he ever found a baby in need of a home, he would let them know. And now that John had just killed Lisa, her baby suddenly needed a home. So he called his brother and gave him the good news. And Donald, feeling incredibly lucky and grateful and believing the whole process had been totally legal, happily agreed to take this baby, and he agreed to pay John the $5,500 for the adoption paperwork. This paperwork was of course forged by John. And after that, Donald and his wife rushed to Kansas City where they met their beautiful little 4-month-old baby girl. They would name her Heather. Before returning with baby Heather to her new home in Chicago, John insisted that they all pose for a family picture. In this picture, which would hang in Heather's house for the next 15 years, Uncle John is seen sitting in the front row, bouncing on his knee, his new 4-month-old niece, whose mother he had literally just murdered. A few days after being told the horrific truth about who she was, DNA and fingerprints would confirm it was all true. Heather really was Lisa Stasi's daughter. But tragically, even though John would confess to murdering Lisa, he would refuse to disclose how he actually killed her or where he dumped her remains. In the story that investigators would piece together, John Robinson was a con man, and in 1985, his cons became deadly. That year, he created the fake charity he called the Kansas City Outreach Program that claimed to help young mothers and their infants get back on their feet, but in reality, John had just created this phony charity to lure a young mother to him so he could kill her and profit off of her baby. This is exactly what he did to Lisa. After handing Lisa's baby, Heather, over to his brother, Donald, John then convinced Donald to pay him the $5,500 for the forged adoption paperwork. Investigators don't know for sure if John killed any more victims after Lisa up until the early 1990s, but he is a strong suspect in at least 2 missing women cases from that time frame. In 1994, John would land in jail in Missouri for fraud, and while in jail, he would meet and seduce Beverly Bonner. Once he got out of jail, he convinced Beverly to divorce her husband and come out to Kansas City to be with him, and when she did this, he killed her and collected that $18,000 settlement check she received from her divorce. After killing Beverly, John discovered the internet. Specifically, he discovered how easy it was to lure people to him using the BDSM community that lived on the internet. And so he remade himself as the slave master online and began brutalizing and killing people at a much more rapid pace. Police believe it was around this point when he became the slave master that John's motives for killing people shifted from killing for monetary gain to killing simply because he wanted to. This is likely the reason why Suzette was murdered. She was simply available. In total, John was found to be responsible for 8 murders, but in theory, it could be more. But John, who is actually still alive awaiting execution, is totally unwilling to give any information up. So there is a very good chance he will take his secrets to the grave. Heather Robinson would ultimately choose to be legally adopted by her parents, Donald and Frida. They truly had no idea what John had done and were, by all accounts, excellent parents to Heather. In 2019, at the age of 35, on the 2020 crime documentary Sole Survivor, Heather broke her long silence about her childhood ordeal. In that interview, Heather said that if she had accepted that offer John had made her back in 2000 at the wedding reception when he said he would buy her a plane ticket to come out to Kansas to spend some alone time with him, she believes he would have killed her and stuffed her in one of those 85-gallon oil drums. Heather, who is now married and a mother herself, said she is committed to finding her own biological mother's remains and returning them to the memorial to Lisa Stasi that now stands empty in the State Line Cemetery in Madison County, Alabama. The headstone there currently reads, "Lisa Stasi, a rose in God's garden." Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please remove the pressure plate from underneath the 5-star review button's enter key on their keyboard. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.